For over a decade, the Golden State Killer terrorized California with a spree of murders, rapes, and break-ins, eluding capture at every turn. Behind the mask was Joseph James DeAngelo, a former cop hiding in plain sight. After 40 years of mystery, cutting-edge DNA technology finally unmasked him in 2018. This is the chilling story of one of America's most infamous criminals and the hunt that brought him to justice. If you're fascinated by true crime and want more deep dives into cases like this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Your support helps us keep bringing you the stories that matter. Let's dive in. The story of the Golden State Killer is one defined not only by the brutality of his crimes, but by the lives he shattered along the way. Each victim in this case is a person whose life was forever altered or tragically cut short by a man who seemed to thrive on fear and control. To understand the impact of his crimes, we look at a few of these individuals, each one representing the human cost of his violent spree. Among his earliest victims were Brian and Katie Maggiore, a young married couple from Rancho Cordova, California, a suburb of Sacramento. In February 1978, they were out for a walk with their dog when they encountered the Golden State Killer, then known as the East Area Rapist. Something about this encounter turned hostile, and within moments both Brian and Katie were running for their lives. They were chased and ultimately shot, found lying near each other in a nearby backyard. This was a shocking escalation from the burglaries and assaults the East Area Rapist had previously committed, and it sent a clear message to the community. No one was safe, not even in their own neighborhood. Brian and Katie were remembered as kind, loving, and devoted to one another, and their deaths left an indelible mark on their friends, family, and neighbors. As his crimes escalated in Southern California under the name the original Night Stalker, his attacks turned fatal more consistently. Lyman and Charlene Smith were a well-respected couple living in Ventura County, where Lyman was a successful attorney and Charlene was a devoted mother. In March 1980, the couple was found brutally murdered in their home, bound and bludgeoned to death. Lyman was set to be appointed as a judge, and their deaths left a void in the legal community. The manner in which they were killed, bound and brutally attacked, sent shockwaves through the area, causing widespread fear and concern that someone so calculating and cold-blooded could strike at any time. The Smiths' murders not only devastated their family and friends, but also underscored the unpredictable and escalating nature of this criminal, fueling a deep sense of dread throughout the community. In 1981, another senseless tragedy took place with the murders of Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez in Goleta, California. Sherry was a loving mother and friend known for her kindness, while Gregory was a recent addition to her life, a young man she was beginning a relationship with. They were attacked in Sherry's home just days before she planned to move out and start fresh. Gregory tried to fight back, but both were overpowered and killed. Their families, friends, and the Goleta community were left in mourning, grappling with the loss and the horror of knowing that someone so violent and remorseless was living among them. Their deaths represented a chilling reminder of the killer's willingness to go to any lengths to assert control, turning the simplest of safe spaces, their home, into the site of unimaginable terror. The emotional impact of these crimes on communities across California was profound. In Sacramento, residents lived in constant fear. The East Area Rapist struck randomly and frequently, targeting both single women and couples, leaving no clear pattern that people could use to feel secure. Nightly routines changed. Families and neighbors kept closer watch on each other. Men began sleeping with weapons nearby. Women would set up makeshift alarms by placing dishes on doors or door handles, and people locked their homes tighter than ever before. Parents worried for their children, couples questioned their own safety, and communities that once felt secure were gripped by a fear that left a lasting mark. In Southern California, the terror only deepened as the crimes escalated to murder. In neighborhoods like Ventura, Goleta, and Irvine, residents watched as this faceless killer continued his assault on innocent lives, feeling as though no measure of security could protect them. The original Night Stalker was methodical, targeting his victims in their own homes, often disabling exterior lights and phone lines. This level of planning suggested he could strike anywhere, anytime, and communities responded with increased vigilance and caution, forever altering how they viewed personal safety. Over time, the Golden State Killer's actions sparked deep, lasting behavioral changes. People in affected areas became more cautious, more vigilant, and in some cases more isolated. Some chose to move away from the region altogether, fearing they could never truly feel safe there again. The case also fueled an early conversation about community awareness and crime prevention, with residents organizing neighborhood watches and community safety programs. Law enforcement faced increasing pressure from the public, who demanded answers and longed for the sense of security that had once defined these California neighborhoods. This case did not just take lives, it stole a sense of peace and security from entire communities, leaving emotional scars that would last for decades. The people of Sacramento and Southern California bore witness to a darkness that lurked in their own backyards, a reminder that safety could be shattered in an instant. And while the Golden State Killer would eventually be brought to justice, the emotional toll he left behind serves as a somber legacy, reminding us of the profound and lasting impact of violence on both individuals and entire communities. The investigation into the Golden State Killer faced enormous challenges from the start, rooted in the limitations of forensic technology in the 1970s and the difficulty of tracking such an elusive mobile criminal. At that time, the most sophisticated tool investigators had was fingerprint analysis, which, while effective, required the suspect to have a previous record or leave behind clear, identifiable prints at a crime scene. But this criminal was meticulous. He rarely left fingerprints, and when he did, they often lacked the clarity necessary for identification. For crimes involving sexual assault, investigators could collect biological evidence, but without today's DNA technology, there was no way to use that evidence to identify a specific individual. This lack of forensic options left law enforcement heavily reliant on witness descriptions, behavioral profiling, and, when possible, matching patterns between crimes. One of the largest barriers in the case was the inability to link the East Area Rapist in Northern California with the original Night Stalker cases in Southern California. Law enforcement agencies across California were often siloed with limited communication or data-sharing infrastructure. The East Area Rapist's crimes, primarily a series of assaults and burglaries, took place in Sacramento and the surrounding areas from 1976 to 1979. When these attacks suddenly stopped, authorities and the public in Northern California assumed he had either fled or been jailed on unrelated charges. It wasn't until much later that anyone suspected he might have moved his activities to Southern California. In Southern California from 1979 to 1981, authorities faced a different series of crimes. Now known as the original Night Stalker, this criminal was murdering his victims, which created an assumption that he was a different offender altogether. The nature of his crimes in the South was different. Instead of sexual assaults and burglaries, he was committing murders with a similar but not identical methodology. Local law enforcement in Southern California was therefore focused on a suspected serial killer, not a burglar or rapist. Without today's centralized databases or DNA testing, connecting these two sprees was difficult, if not impossible, at the time. The crimes were logged in separate jurisdictions, often with separate systems and criteria for categorizing incidents, meaning it took years before anyone realized the similarities between the cases. Despite these barriers, law enforcement poured substantial resources into the case, refusing to let it fade. Local detectives in Sacramento and Southern California, who had seen firsthand the destruction left in the wake of this criminal, dedicated their careers to keeping the investigation alive. Detectives like Carol Daly in Sacramento became well known for their tireless work and commitment to supporting victims. Daly, one of the few female detectives in her department, spent countless hours interviewing victims and piecing together the rapist's modus operandi, building a psychological profile that would eventually help narrow the search for potential suspects. The detectives involved in this case refused to let the community forget about it, continuing to investigate every possible lead, even when it seemed the trail had gone cold. Journalists also played a vital role in maintaining public interest in the case. Reporters from local newspapers in Sacramento and later in Southern California kept the story alive, continually reminding the public of the unresolved danger and the need for vigilance. As the case went cold, public interest would sometimes wane, but the dedication of certain journalists brought renewed attention whenever a new angle or potential lead surfaced. Their work helped keep the pressure on law enforcement to continue pursuing the case, and it kept communities on edge, fostering a determination to remain vigilant and cautious. Community members, too, were deeply invested in solving the case. Residents in affected neighborhoods took extraordinary steps to protect themselves, organizing neighborhood watches, investing in home security measures, and developing safety protocols to reduce vulnerability. Neighborhood watch groups became more active than ever, with volunteers patrolling their streets, keeping eyes on any unusual activity, and reporting it directly to law enforcement. These collective efforts marked one of the early instances of true community police partnerships in crime prevention, setting a precedent for how residents could work with law enforcement to create safer neighborhoods. The breakthrough in the Golden State Killer case came after decades of frustration and dead ends, finally made possible by advancements in DNA technology. In the 1970s and 80s, when the crimes took place, DNA profiling was non-existent. Investigators could collect biological evidence, but there was no way to identify an individual based on it. This changed in the 1980s, when DNA analysis first became a forensic tool. Over time, the technology improved, and by the 1990s, law enforcement agencies across the country began using DNA databases to solve cases, including cold cases. However, while detectives could now connect the crimes of the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, they still lacked the suspect's identity, as no matching DNA profile existed in law enforcement databases. The true breakthrough came with the rise of genetic genealogy, a field that uses DNA to establish family connections. By the late 2010s, genealogical databases like GEDmatch allowed individuals to upload their DNA profiles, often taken from consumer DNA testing kits, to learn more about their ancestry and connect with relatives. In 2018, investigators made a decision that would prove to be a turning point. They uploaded DNA evidence from one of the Golden State Killer's crime scenes into a publicly available genealogy database. This was a crucial move, as it bypassed the traditional criminal databases and looked instead for relatives of the suspect, offering a new way to close in on his identity without needing his DNA directly in the system. Through GEDmatch, investigators found a partial match to a distant relative of the Golden State Killer. This initial match didn't provide an immediate answer, as it was only a distant link, but it offered a crucial lead. With this information, genealogists and law enforcement worked backwards, building an extensive family tree by analyzing relatives and tracing back through generations to identify common ancestors. The process required intense collaboration between detectives and genealogists, piecing together names, relationships, and potential locations. As the list of potential suspects narrowed, law enforcement focused on individuals who fit the age, location, and behavioral profile they had developed over the years for the Golden State Killer. One name eventually stood out: Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who had lived in areas near the crime scenes during the time of the attacks. His background and location history fit, and investigators were determined to confirm his identity as the suspect. To do so, they needed a direct DNA sample from DeAngelo himself. In a covert operation, law enforcement followed DeAngelo, waiting for an opportunity to collect his DNA without alerting him. Eventually, they obtained a sample from an item he discarded, ensuring that it could be tested without his knowledge. When this sample was analyzed and compared to the crime scene evidence, the results were definitive. Joseph James DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. On April 24, 2018, after more than 40 years of evading justice, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California. The 72-year-old had lived quietly in the neighborhood for years, blending in as an ordinary retiree. When detectives arrived, they found DeAngelo standing outside his home, working on a project in his driveway. Without resistance, he was taken into custody, finally ending the mystery surrounding one of the most infamous unsolved crime sprees in California's history. DeAngelo's arrest was shocking not just for his neighbors, but for many in law enforcement who learned that he had once been one of their own. From 1973 to 1979, DeAngelo had served as a police officer in two California towns, Exeter and Auburn. His role as an officer gave him insight into police procedures, knowledge he would later use to elude investigators. In 1979, he was fired from the Auburn Police Department after being caught shoplifting, but by that time he had already committed numerous burglaries and assaults across Northern California. His background in law enforcement may have been one reason he was able to evade suspicion. He knew how to avoid leaving evidence, often wearing gloves, disabling lights, and meticulously preparing for his attacks. Following his arrest, DeAngelo was charged with 13 counts of murder, which included cases from both his East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker crime sprees. Prosecutors from multiple California counties collaborated on the case to ensure he would be held accountable for the full scope of his crimes. His legal proceedings were extensive, given the gravity of the charges and the number of victims. The prosecution initially sought the death penalty, but the case's complexity, spanning decades and involving numerous jurisdictions, added to the logistical and financial challenges of a lengthy death penalty trial. In June 2020, DeAngelo agreed to a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to 13 murders and numerous other crimes, including rape and kidnapping, finally acknowledging the devastation he had caused. His plea was part of an agreement to spare him from the death penalty, but it ensured he would spend the rest of his life behind bars without the possibility of parole. During the proceedings, victims and their families had the chance to confront him, sharing their grief, anger, and sense of closure in a series of emotional impact statements. In August 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, bringing a definitive end to his decades-long reign of terror. This sentence, which included multiple consecutive life terms, ensured that DeAngelo would spend the rest of his life in prison. Given his guilty plea to 13 murders as well as numerous charges related to assaults, kidnappings, and burglaries, the court's decision reflected the severity of his crimes and the devastation he left in his wake. During the sentencing, victims and family members had the opportunity to confront DeAngelo directly, expressing the pain, trauma, and grief they had endured over the years. Some family members shared stories of loved ones lost, recounting the lasting impact of his crimes on their lives and their communities. Others expressed relief that after more than 40 years, they could finally close a chapter marked by fear and unanswered questions. Many of these statements were deeply emotional, revealing the long-lasting scars left by his actions. The public reaction to DeAngelo's sentencing was also significant. For years, communities across California had lived with the memory of the Golden State Killer's crimes, and his conviction brought a collective sense of justice and closure. Law enforcement officials who had worked tirelessly over the decades to keep the case alive viewed his sentencing as a testament to the dedication and advancements in forensic science that had finally led to his capture. For many, DeAngelo's life sentence served not only as justice, but as a reminder of the resilience of those affected and the commitment of the investigators who never gave up on solving the case. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want to see more true crime content, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us keep bringing you these stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.